Hello, I am Eli Adashi, Professor of Medical Science at Brown University and host of Medscape One-on-One. Joining me today is Dr. John Howard, an occupational physician, a lawyer, and the director of NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Our topic: understanding the potential impact of the Gulf oil spill on our nation's health. Welcome, Dr. Howard. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me here on your program.
Can you briefly describe to our audience the role of NIOSH in this and in related disasters?
Well, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, as most folks call us that are familiar with us, is basically an institute which is established by the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970.
I see.
Similarly, in that same act, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was established, or OSHA.
OSHA.
Our role within the act is to do the research, make recommendations to OSHA and to employers and workers about how to protect themselves. Our recommendations are used by OSHA to do regulations or standards.
I see.
Our research then has that outcome. That's the one that we think is more important for us, although our research is used by all sorts of folks. We give grants out to academic centers. We have 17 education and research centers in academic medical centers throughout the United States. So we fund researchers in various universities throughout the United States. We have 7 agricultural health and safety centers that are often also located in academic medical centers or in medical schools throughout the United States that do work exclusively in agricultural safety and health. We offer, as the National Institutes of Health do, extramural grants.
Yes.
So we support, like NIH supports, the research that's necessary to move the occupational safety and health knowledge into the future. Now, the other part of the question is, what is our role in terms of these large events, which often people call disasters or spills, depending on what they are. Our role there is part of our institute has a wonderful group of folks that go out as frontline evaluators during a disaster to assess what are the issues that are going to impact the workers, the response workers who are responding to that disaster. Now, there are professional responders, such as firefighters,
Right.
police, and other emergency responders. But also, if the event is big enough, as we saw in the Gulf of Mexico, tens of thousands of others that aren't professional responders come into the area to do cleanup, reconstruction, recovery, you name it. So our folks go out and look at the hazards that those responders are facing in order for us to provide guidance to employers. OSHA uses our guidance too to protect the responders during their response activities.
Would it be fair to say that you're, in a sense, the core scientific organization of this nation when it comes to occupational and other forms of health safety?
I think that's a fair statement because there's only one Occupational Safety and Health Act on the federal level, and we are the designated institute to generate new knowledge in the field of occupational safety and health. But I always try to point out that it's not just us that work in the institute. Our partners in medical centers and universities throughout the United States are our true partners in generating that knowledge.
Of course, but in part through your support.
Yes.
Yes. Well, turning now to perhaps the recent event, Many of our viewers probably would be interested to know, why is crude or weathered oil, or for that matter some of the ingredients thereof, hazardous to one's health?
Well, this question is very complex. And one point I want to make to anybody listening, whether they be a physician, nurse, any kind of healthcare provider, there is about 3 million gallons of oil per year that leak into waterways in the United States.
One way or the other?
One way or the other. A tanker spill, a leak out of a tanker that's moored in a harbor, or this massive type of spill that we've encountered in the Gulf of Mexico, which is really an outlier.
And how many magnitudes or orders of magnitude difference are we talking about here between the background level and the recent acute spill?
The recent event in the Gulf of Mexico really is a tremendous outlier. The only thing close enough in the United States that would compare is when the Exxon Valdez tanker ran aground. Otherwise, a lot of the leaks or spills of crude oil or refined product, okay, because we have tankers that carry refined petroleum products, they can also leak. But the point is that if you're a physician anywhere in the United States, you don't have to be a physician in the Gulf to say, oh, well, that wouldn't concern me. No, you may see individuals who are professional responders,
right,
or voluntary responders, or have been recruited for a particular event.
In the context
you
of
may
smaller
exactly. You may see them as patients. So don't just focus on the Gulf of Mexico, because it's certainly the biggest event, but you can see patients that have been exposed as responders or members of the community.
And why or how, to just go back to the original question.
Right, which I jumped over. So
no, right. I mean, what is it about oil that is potentially dangerous?
Well, crude oil, the best way that I understand it, and that's, to me, my test of whether I can explain it well, it's a mixture. It's a mixture of a lot of different chemicals. Some of those chemicals are volatile, meaning they have very low boiling points. And the minute they hit the atmosphere, they become gaseous. Okay? Now, some of those things like benzene, toluene, naphthalene, those are quite toxic. Benzene, for instance, is a carcinogen. Produces, with enough exposure over a long enough period of time, leukemia. Those volatiles, then, are a serious issue in crude oil exposure. But because they vaporize and often disappear and are diluted in the atmosphere, unless you're right over a crude oil spill, what you encounter, and what we encountered in the Gulf of Mexico, is crude that's been weathered by evaporation of the volatiles, mixing around in the wave action that occurs. Those volatiles are gone, and then what's left is often this sort of tarry, asphalt kind of looking thing, the tar patty that we saw on the TV. We can see sometimes slicks on the surface of water where we see accumulated oil, or moussey. It's called mousse, like mousse, hair mousse, or that is a thicker kind of gelatinous material. And in those cases, usually the volatiles are gone. So when you look at those weathered crude products, you're talking about longer chain carbon chemicals. They are acute skin irritants. And they also can be associated, the aromatic cyclical versions of those have been associated with cancer also. So in terms of the acute exposure, we look for skin irritation, because you can develop rashes from contact with crude oil. If you're exposed to the volatiles, they can cause nausea, headache. It's like an acute intoxication. Toluene, xylene, for instance, are the types of short carbon chains, volatiles that can be found in crude. And they produce a type of intoxication. The acute effects then are primarily neurological, gastrointestinal, some respiratory irritation, throat irritation,
Yes.
respiratory cough. And then the longer term tend to be the more cancer producing. That's what we're most concerned about with folks that have had long-term exposure. Oil workers who work
Right.
in the industry, for instance, as opposed to a responder that has a short-term exposure.
Right. Thus far, to the extent that you can surmise, what kind of acute symptoms have been observed, and what numbers of individuals potentially have been affected?
When we looked at this Gulf of Mexico spill, one of the things that we wanted to do was to collect as much information as we could about acute health effects that were being seen in communities that surround the Gulf area. So at CDC, we started collecting information from the 5 Gulf states and their state health departments that were monitoring. For instance, are we seeing more asthma? Are physicians reporting
Yes.
more asthma? Because we know that respiratory effects,
Yes.
nose irritation, throat irritation, tightness in the chest, asthma could be a sign of that. We then looked at gastrointestinal complaints, nausea, vomiting, headaches, intoxication. So we began surveilling the state health departments to get a handle on what they were seeing in the community, or individual physicians may
Yes.
be reporting. But we also then looked at the safety and health logs that the employers who
I
were
see.
contractors for these responders were reporting.
I
What
see.
we saw during the Gulf response is we saw a lot of heat-related stress issues. It's very hot in the Gulf.
Right.
Even in May, April, May, when this Gulf response started.
Right.
We're in the 90s, heat indexes exceeding 100. We saw a lot of folks dehydration. We saw folks who hadn't been screened before they became a responder. And this is a point that I would make to practicing physicians too. If they have any patient that they see who says, I want to be a responder, I want to go down there and help, or I am a responder and I am helping, well, if they have uncontrolled hypertension and they're going out in a heat stress situation, that's not good. So I think it's important for us in our work to tell physicians pre-placement evaluation is an extremely important step in ensuring the health of a responder.
Right.
Because we don't want to send people out that have unstable medical conditions. So heat stress was number one. The other things that we saw were lacerations, because you're handling a lot of equipment
Yes.
that could cut, rashes, and then, dehydration. You're out there, people are getting headachy, you're not sure what's going on. A lot of reports of headache, dehydration. And most of the times that we saw folks having to go get first aid or advanced medical care was heat or
Yes.
dehydration.
Now, you mentioned very briefly potential chronic effects like myeloproliferative disorders in response to benzene, I believe. What is the state of the knowledge to the extent that there is a repository of information on the long-term consequences of this and related disasters? Granted, this is way too early for this particular situation, but what do we know and how can we extrapolate with some certainty to the future?
Well, this is really an excellent question, and I wish that I had all of the information that we require to be able to answer your question fully and to tell the audience more than what I know right now. If you look at the world's literature on oil spills, whether it be a tanker spill, tanker running aground, or in this case, a well having a gusher like this for months on end, there is precious little in the way of data for chronic effects. Most of the world's literature focuses on acute effects. What are the acute effects on a responder population or the nearby community? And they tend to be the types of things that we've just talked about.
Yes.
There are a few studies that have gone as far as 6 months later, And they've said some of those folks still have some respiratory complaints. Others don't. But we don't have good studies of longer-term health effects in the responder population to a spill. Now, there are studies of petroleum workers, who spend their life in the petroleum industry. That's a different thing. But in the response area, no. People always ask me, well, didn't they study the Exxon Valdez responders?
Right.
And the answer is no. And then the next question is, why not? Well, these are very interesting situations, and there are more than just the health issues at stake. As we're seeing now, and we'll continue to see with the Gulf, there will be an attempt to find out what happened, who's to blame, the attachment of blame. So all of our friends in the legal world come into play.
Right.
And those kinds of things sometimes are difficult for a health study to get accomplished during that time. But I'm happy to report that this time in the Gulf of Mexico, the National Institutes for Health are working on a longer-term health study, meaning following these individuals over time, 5 to 20 years, to see what kind of longer-term health effects this responder population, and I'm happy to report that other parts of the federal government are looking at the community, because one of the issues in the community has been the significant mental health stress that the community has had.
Yes.
As you know, this is an area that's had multiple traumas from the mental health standpoint.
From what we have been led to believe or read, the NIH has dedicated $10 million for the research in question, I believe, which was contributed by BP to this end. I also seem to recall that BP is going to dedicate something on the order of $500 million towards this and similar ends. Can you tell us a little bit about how we as a nation plan to use these resources and how your agency plans to go about documenting long-term consequences, which you pointed out so well, have not been studied before?
Well, I think this is an important issue, and one that I think we have now the right set of policies in place. In other words, people are actively saying we need to follow workers and community over time. We cannot leave this situation. We need to fill in these gaps in the medical literature about longer-term health effects. So we've talked about the NIH study, and that is a study that may go over time, 5 to 20 years, funded both by NIH as well as by jointly by BP, and also from the Recovery and Restoration funds, which are going to be made available by Secretary Mabus, who is the Navy Secretary who President Obama has tasked with the idea, with the task of looking at what kind of funds we need for recovery and restoration of the Gulf. And then in addition, as you pointed out, BP has established a Gulf Research Institute, which has an advisory committee of prominent physicians and scholars that sit on that committee. And they have made the commitment of $500 million for researchers who want to look at aspects of the longer-term health effects on responders or on the community. So those types of studies, I think, are planned now. We did. When you look back in 1989 at the Exxon Valdez event, none of that was going on. So that we're, I think, right now dedicated to looking at this issue, not only for the responders who participated, but as you know in medical science, often the greatest benefits of some of these longer-term studies accrue to responders of the future.
So sounds indeed like a substantial investment in the future. If I may turn now to dispersants, in a similar fashion to what we were trying to address with the oil, what is known about the health hazards associated with dispersants? Why are they, if they are, hazardous to your health?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand most of the literature on toxicity of dispersants are to the to the biological organisms that inhabit the sea, whether they be birds or mammals or fish.
So non-human studies.
Exactly. I think we have more information there than we do on the human side. When you look at, why dispersants, why are they being used? There's a lot of literature on this. The National Academy of Sciences did a report in 1989. They did another report in 2005. The major reasons for using dispersants are to decrease the impact on the shoreline if oil is broken up, to decrease the impact on birds and mammals, and also to increase the biodegradation of the oil so that it is able to be eaten by, in the case of the Gulf of Mexico, bacteria that actually feed on hydrocarbons. So that's the purpose of it. For us in NIOSH, we cautioned about aerial spraying of dispersant because there are workers underneath those airplanes, and we said, is there some way that we can avoid that? So BP switched to applying the dispersant in the column of crude oil that was coming up from the Macondo well, so subsurface application. But right now, when we look at dispersants, they are essentially another or a mixture of more hydrocarbons. So we can't get away from a hydrocarbon society. So they are essentially other types of hydrocarbons. Some manufactured that the ingredients are proprietary. So it's hard for everybody to know what's in them. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency, CDC, we've gotten knowledge about what's in them. We've looked at toxicity. And some dispersants have a higher concentration of some more worrisome chemicals. There's some hemolytic agents that are in some of those surfactants, because essentially they're a mixture of surfactants. Sometimes people refer to them as like dish detergent. They break up oily things. But some have a high concentration. One particular thing is butoxyethanol, which can be a hemolytic agent. The issue about whether dispersants used in this kind of volume, we're talking about almost 1 million pounds now. This is the largest use of dispersants. This is going to be on the health agenda and the public policy agenda for a long time. On the health agenda, because what are the long-term effects of people exposed to dispersants? And two, is this the way we're going to handle oil spills from now on? Are we going to apply dispersants in this kind of volume? So the dispersant issue is one that may not be totally settled at the present time. But clearly, I think it will remain on our health agenda and on the public policy agenda when it comes to how do you take care of an oil spill.
It might be fair to say that our knowledge base for dispersants is still nascent, and that many of the funds that are being invested will presumably address dispersants as well as other elements.
Yes. In fact, in NIOSH, we're doing some animal toxicity studies looking at dispersant, which we've obtained from the Nalco Corporation, who was the exclusive contractor to BP. They were kind enough to give us a sample of the dispersants they use. We also got unadulterated crude from the Macondo well that's not contaminated with the dispersant. And we're now doing acute animal toxicity studies, looking at dispersant, looking at crude oil, looking at a combination of both, because we don't know. There could be a synergistic effect of the dispersant and the crude. So we're looking at that from an animal toxicity study. We hope to continue that work. And as you pointed out, then looking at what the effects are in exposed populations. So I think we have a lot to learn for dispersants, and I think it's important to learn that, because if we're going to use them in this volume for the next spill, then it's important that we have this information available.
Sounds like you're well underway with many of these efforts. Our audience probably would be also very interested in finding out what type of surveillance is currently being employed on multiple fronts, especially though related to human health. And for how long do we plan to maintain this? Is this a commitment we have made to ourselves for the next decade, say, or beyond? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I think the answer to that is two-part. One is we utilize the existing surveillance systems that are in place that every state has, and the 5 Gulf states have quite a few different surveillance systems. We also then used new ones. For instance, BP contracted with poison control centers. We then collected the calls that they were getting to see whether or not we saw any blips in certain things. There are a lot of people calling saying that I'm having a lot of respiratory problems. We then looked at that data in relationship then to the third arm of that data, which is what are people saying within medical institutions, either urgent care clinics, for those types of institutions. What are they saying? Are they reporting anything new and different? So that was active surveillance that we were doing
of where the patients are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at the longer term. One of the things that we just got funded is a survey which is done, a behavioral health survey that's done routinely, that CDC does. We're now adding some questions to that relate to the spill.
I see.
So that survey and those questions, that survey is a longitudinal survey that goes on regularly. So with those questions added, we can leave those questions in for the 5 Gulf states for the next 10 years, as you say, in order to be able to trace what some of those issues may be. Because as you know, the behavioral health issues tend sometimes to show up a little later. They tend to be extinguished much later. And as we know, the Gulf, with multiple hurricanes several years ago, Katrina being the biggest one, this spill, this is a community that has, in Mississippi and Alabama, has undergone multiple traumas.
Obviously. Before closing, another question that I suspect most of our audience would want to know, especially the healthcare providers, has to do with the safety of the food that derives from the Gulf, especially seafood. What can you share with us on the safety of that seafood or the lack thereof?
Well, first of all, I would say that the primary responsibility for assessing the safety of seafood comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. They're the ones who declared certain areas of the Gulf, no fishing. They're the ones that made the decision to open up certain areas, okay? And the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. Those two agencies have the primary responsibility.
Understood.
FDA obviously tests food, and as we've, I think, all seen on the TV, they use 2 different types of testing. One is the testing by smelling the seafood products, and they have trained individuals who can tell seafood apparently by olfactory sensation. And then the other is by actually chemical testing. And there were areas that were closed to fishing. They've reopened. And now, as we saw President Obama in his visits and the first family going down and eating seafood, and most recently we saw the commissioner of the FDA, Margaret Hamburg, and the White House executive chef go to an event in New Orleans in which they learned how to cook Gulf seafood in many different ways. So certainly the seafood that Americans have on their in their stores and on their dinner plate is safe. And in fact, I personally want to volunteer to eat any Gulf seafood that I can get my hands on.
That's very reassuring. In closing, it is hurricane season. There's no way of ruling out another one. Hopefully that's not the case. But if that were to transpire, in what way would it affect the situation in the Gulf, especially, again, the issue of human health?
Right. Well, I think right now, today when we're recording this show, we expect within 48 hours for Admiral Allen to announce the well is dead. The bottom kill process is going on now. So we don't expect any new oil from that well.
Understood.
The issue, though, about the oil that went into the Gulf is still, as you've read in the newspaper and we've all seen, is still maybe alive, because we now have a very prominent university who has looked at the bottom of the Gulf and has seen layers of oil that lie on the bottom of the Gulf. So with regard to your question, and I'm no expert in this area, but I've listened to the NOAA experts, I've listened to the Weather Channel on the shows on this issue, is whether or not a large hurricane coming into the Gulf with that kind of power and wave action might be able to bring up some of the sediment from the bottom of the Gulf and bring more of that crude onto the shoreline into the Louisiana marshes. I think that's an open question. We certainly hope that that doesn't happen. But I know some of the commentators on the weather side are asking those kinds of questions.
Well, I want to thank you very much for a very informative discussion.
Thank you.
And I know that the healthcare providers who tune in to these conversations, I think, are very much reassured by having a healthcare professional at the helm.
Thank you very much.
On this note, sincere thanks to Dr. John Howard and to you, our viewers, for joining Medscape One-on-One. Until next time, I am Eli Adashi.